Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director of Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Campaigns Officer. Hi.
Senior Campaigns Officer.
Soon to be Campaigns Coordinator.
Yeah.
By the time this goes out, I'll be PI's Campaigns Coordinator.
Actually, technically, August 1st. Yeah.
And I'm Caitlin, PI's Campaigns Coordinator. Hi.
Caitlin, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so you've heard us talk about facial recognition before in our podcast about Clearview, in our podcast about PIMIs, in our podcast about evading facial recognition, in our podcast about protest surveillance, in our other podcast about Clearview, and I think that's all of them. There might be more. So you've heard us talk about facial recognition quite a lot, but we back because there's turns out more to say. This week specifically, we're talking about the UK and the UK's government's use of facial recognition, about which we are not necessarily thrilled about. Fair to say, I think. Yeah.
Now, globally, there have been some really interesting developments around facial recognition technology and the use particularly by police or at borders or by companies. And we've seen in some jurisdictions the banning of the use of facial recognition technology. We've seen litigation of abuses and whatnot. And so what's been most disappointing about the United Kingdom is that it exists in its own bubble. And the government seems to just continue on its march towards finding a new toy and using that toy as it sees fit.
Yeah, I'm seemingly unencumbered or unworried about places like New York, which has straightforwardly banned facial recognition technology, or, even councils like Islington Council in the UK, which has said, please stop using live facial recognition technology in our area. And it's for all the reasons you've heard of before, like Islington are worried because it's potentially discriminatory, because it doesn't recognize, Black and Southeast Asian people as well as it does white people, which means if you're Black or South Asian and you're walking along the street, you're much more likely to be falsely recognized, misidentified as someone the police are looking for, much more likely to be pulled aside. And in the case of one Black teen in London fairly recently, fingerprinted and kind of subject to further engagement with the police, which is not fun, I would say. I don't think anyone's idea of a good time is being pulled off the street by the police and made to prove that you're not someone that you're not. And we're not, unfortunately, just talking about law enforcement uses. Because of the lack of much specific regulation or legislation, facial recognition technology is being picked up and used in loads of different private contexts. And if you've been following PI for a while, you'll have seen our work on a company called FaceWatch, who have been used pretty extensively by the Co-op.
Which is a UK-based grocery store.
Yes. And that's kind of all part and parcel to the context that we're talking about this week, which is one in which facial recognition is proliferating, I think it's fair to say, without necessarily the amount of transparency or oversight that we would prefer. I mean, we prefer it doesn't, but we're not that optimistic.
And I think for most people, when they imagine what it is for police and companies to use the technology in a democracy under the rule of law, they would presume that it means that their Congress or their Senate or their Parliament would approve of a law called the Facial Recognition Technology Law of 2024. And in that law, it will prescribe exactly when this type of technology can be used, when it can't be used, and the rights that people have to appeal. And that imaginary world, unfortunately, hasn't arisen yet, in that parliaments and senates and congresses aren't necessarily passing these kinds of laws. Governments aren't exactly proposing these kinds of laws. And ideally, the law would be able to identify whether or not the right conditions have been established before the deployment of this facial recognition technology. And that's actually quite interesting and complex and contentious, right, Caitlin?
Yeah. So in the UK, there was a specific case in South Wales around the use of facial recognition technology that kind of progressed through the courts. And one of the things the court said was that there were fundamental deficiencies in the legal framework, which meant that the use of facial recognition by South Wales Police had breached people's rights. And it's those fundamental deficiencies that kind of really concern us.
And perhaps the lack of a legal framework that always needs to be established in a democracy under the rule of law. That's a fancy word for saying, is there a law? And does it actually work at holding to account the use of something?
And it's the positive legal framework that we're looking for that explicitly mentions facial recognition and explicitly sets out safeguards and rules around its use. Whereas what we're working with at the moment is a kind of negative legal framework by which there is just nothing. Like there's some little bits for data protection, there's some little bits under random different laws, none of which explicitly mention facial recognition, none of which appropriately provide safeguards or oversight for its use, and none of which provide that positive, explicit legal regime that we're looking for.
This is where I nerd out just a little bit, because one of the issues I've been navigating across my entire career of working on technology, policy, and human rights is whether or not you need technology-specific law or technology-neutral law. The difference between technology-specific and technology-neutral is that technology-specific law would be a law on facial recognition technology as we understand it in 2024, versus a technology-neutral law would be a law about the use of surveillance in the public sphere by law enforcement that may include the analysis of people's faces using cameras. And so as those cameras get more sophisticated or the facial recognition component gets more sophisticated, the law has to catch up. The reason these things matter and the reason I nerd out on it is because my earliest foray into law, because I'm not a lawyer, was looking at communications surveillance law when it was being introduced. That is, when back in the 1920s, the police started listening into telephone communications because they tried to argue that, yeah, the existing laws talk about communication surveillance in the form of breaking into people's homes and taking their stuff or going to the post office and taking their letters. And they actually argue it in courts saying, we didn't take anything. All we did was listen in. And so therefore, it is not surveillance. And the courts almost agreed because the law was technology neutral. And because it didn't say intercept, it didn't say listen, the government said they have a right to get away with this. And that's why we're always navigating these challenges. And so a law written 10 years ago on, say, the surveillance of public spaces would have no appreciation of the technology that's capable today. And that's why we constantly need to have this revisiting, this re-understanding of what is within reach of law enforcement. The catch is law enforcement agencies hate admitting the technologies they're using, and they will gloss over their legality by saying, oh, there's a legal framework in place for the use of technology in surveillance in public spaces. And this is why organizations like us exist, to keep on interrogating and pushing and prodding to make sure every stakeholder understands what's at play.
And I think, you'll hear us say a lot that facial recognition is particularly intrusive. And there are things about facial recognition and the processing of biometric data in this way that are unique and specific that aren't really captured by, previous laws that exist on things like CCTV cameras. CCTV cameras have their own issues and can be quite invasive, but it's not really the same thing as someone taking, your face print, which is, not necessarily the most scientific way of calling it, but taking your face print as you move around a public space and matching it up, ideally, to either your specific identity or saying, you're not a number of people on this list. And it's that kind of process that we're talking about, and whether that's regulated specifically in terms of facial recognition itself, whether it's, more broad and it's biometric data and it's public surveillance, it's public spaces, it's something about you can't change being captured and stored by police and by private companies. And then it's that information being taken and either compared to a watch list of, quote unquote bad guys, so how people get on that watch list and how that information is processed, stored, decided, rolled out, are all deeply concerning. And it's something that in the UK, at least, the police have gotten in trouble for before, for storing images they shouldn't have still been storing and uploading them to these databases to check on people. So custody images, for example, of people who had not been found guilty. So that's already a lot of problems with the watch list. But then the slippery slope version of this, and the version that Clearview and other companies represent, is being able to identify everyone all the time. So as you walk around the world, all of these huge array of cameras don't just capture kind of your image, but also capture your identity and your name and your face, which is quite difficult, painful, and expensive to change. So yeah, they are creepy and they are kind of uniquely invasive and uniquely, in a very science fiction-y way, dystopian. And it's sometimes quite hard to articulate what we mean by how invasive they are, because not everyone gets the same ick that we do, I think, when you think about it. But if you actually think about that, what that would mean for you as you step outside your door, as you go to the doctors, as you go to shopping, as you buy, fast food or McDonald's or whatever it is, and do lots of things that aren't necessarily illegal, but maybe you're embarrassed by, or maybe you just don't want people to know, like your HIV status or any number of other things.
And Caitlin, you're articulating from the perspective of the concerned individual who's concerned about their own privacy, but there's always the additional dynamic of, is this a power you want your police and these companies and the state or other states to have? And so you could be concerned about it for your own privacy, but you can also be concerned about it for the state of the democracy or the context within which you live. And what we were on a mission to understand is the degree to which our policymakers and our elected officials understand the very technology that the governments and the police and the private companies actually want to start using.
So next up, you're going to hear from Sarah and you're going to hear from Josie, who are on the project running our work in this area, about what we decided to do about it.
Hi, my name is Sarah Sims and I'm a policy officer at Privacy International.
My name's Josie Tim and I'm an advocacy officer at Privacy International.
Excellent. So we're here this week to talk about the campaign that you guys have been running on facial recognition technology in the UK. What was the campaign and what were we concerned about?
So we launched our campaign at the end of Privacy in Public, basically to raise awareness of the use of FRT throughout the UK, which is rapidly increasing, mostly by police forces. It's being deployed at specific events. For example, it was deployed at the King's Coronation, Pride events, protests. There's been increasing deployments, particularly across London. This year, we've seen deployments in Croydon, Tooting, Catford, and these will take place at even tube stations and out in public streets. We're also seeing an increase in private use of FRT. This is mainly within retail spaces. So, for example, in shops, we've seen shops such as Fraser Group, Co-op, Home Bargains have installed facial recognition within some of their stores. They use a company called FaceWatch. And so far, there have already been complaints around that use and misidentifications.
What would you say our concerns are? Like, as people start to use this technology, why does that worry us?
Yeah, well, like Sarah was describing, in the UK, as one example, what we've been campaigning on, this is happening in public spaces. This is more often than not going on without the actual knowledge or consent of the people who are walking past these cameras and whose data is being collected and used. And in essence, it's a technology that is really highly invasive. It relies on the use of very sensitive biometric data. It's obviously coming from our bodies, and it's being rolled out in the UK in a way that is very dystopian, and that is, in essence, a form of mass surveillance.
Yeah, if we think of the 3Ds, it's discriminatory, dystopian, and disproportionate. So it's discriminatory, firstly, in the fact that the FRT technology will be trained on a data set that has inherent biases. This will lead to issues of inaccuracies and misidentifying people, particularly women and people from ethnic minorities.
What makes facial recognition particularly invasive as compared to traditional cameras and watch lists and other forms of mass surveillance?
So particularly with live facial recognition, it will be deployed in public spaces, on our streets, particularly, at tube stations. Often people are going about their lives without actually being able to give informed consent of this type of technology. It's extremely invasive in that it's collecting our biometric data, which is unique to us as individuals. So It interferes with our privacy, particularly if it's used in certain places such as protests. It's even interfering with our wider rights, such as freedom of expression, association, and assembly.
Yeah, exactly. Despite the heightened sensitivity of the type of data that it's collecting, biometric data, which generally should be subjected to additional safeguards. In the UK, specifically, there's no actual legislation that exists to specifically regulate the use of FRT. So it's being rolled out in this kind of democratic vacuum. And that's another major concern.
Yeah, and actually, we are seeing countries, across the world and other places that are introducing measures to ban or place restrictions on FRT. So, for example, the EU AI Act included restrictions on the use of live FRT and also provided safeguards for the use of retrospective FRT.
I mean, you talk about a democratic vacuum, which brings us, I think, pretty neatly onto what the campaign started with, right? So step one of the campaign was just asking MPs, what do you know about FRT? How did that go?
Not very well. Well, it went well in the sense that, we were able to launch this campaign, the end of privacy in public. And as part of that, we did a YouGov survey of MPs to see, as you said, what do they know about the actual use of this technology in the UK. So it was a random sample of 114 anonymous cross-party MPs in June 2023. And the results was that they don't know very much at all, unfortunately. Limited knowledge, to say the least, on the use of how and where this technology is actually being deployed.
When you say limited, how limited?
Well, 70% of the respondents to the survey did not know whether or not FRT was being used in their own constituencies. Obviously, this is extremely concerning because it shows that there is a huge lack of knowledge about whether a highly intrusive surveillance technology is being used upon their own constituents in public spaces, which they have been elected to represent people who live there. Yeah, and that was something that we found very worrying.
Yeah, we also asked MPs if they were aware if there was a specific law pertaining to the use of FRT in the UK. And 42% said that they were aware that there was no law. 24% wrongly think that there was a law. And 34%, they didn't know if there was a law.
Yeah, I mean, both answers kind of point to a fundamental lack of knowledge amongst MPs. They seemed quite lost and confused about it, judging from the survey results. And basically, it is really concerning because ultimately it shows that there's little political oversight of this really intrusive tech that's being rolled out on a really wide scale, across the country.
When it comes to the police have been brought up in court a couple of different times on deployment of facial recognition, including the, South Wales case, the Bridgend case, where they were taken to court and the court said, well, no, there's nothing that appropriately regulates FRT. You should probably stop doing that. And the police have kind of continued regardless, which suggests that Parliament really is the primary or arguably only realistic oversight that we're going to get over facial recognition technology. So their kind of lack of interest is pretty seriously concerning, especially given some of the stories that we've heard about facial recognition technology. I actually want to talk a bit more about the use in the private sector, because I think this is one of the ones that freaks me out arguably the most, because whilst the police have the power to arrest people and they have the power to pull people aside and fingerprint people, which they have because of misidentification on facial recognition technology, there is at least some oversight and process involved in that. Whereas the use of facial recognition technology in private spaces like shops, you don't have as much protection, recourse, support, oversight of that use, right? It's FaceWatch that has collections of shops using FRT that they share images of people they believe to be shoplifters around. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a surge in the private sector using FRT, particularly in retail spaces, to tackle shoplifting. There's a particular retail companies that seem to be doing this. So there's Fraser's Group, they would own House of Fraser. We're also seeing it in Co-op as well as Home Bargains. And recently there was a particular case with Home Bargains where a young teenage girl was stopped and she was told that she was a known shoplifter and she was banned from the Home Bargains stores. She is now taking civil action against Home Bargains and FaceWatch, are the company that deploy that technology, the company that is responsible for supplying that technology to Home Bargains.
Yeah, and just to add that FaceWatch last year in 2023, it was reported that they had a closed door meeting with, at the time, the Minister for Policing, Chris Philps. And the minutes of this meeting revealed that Philps appears to have put pressure on an independent oversight body, the Information Commissioner's Office, by writing to them and actually encouraging that they consider so-called benefits of this technology, FRT. And that was another really worrying thing to see in the kind of overall landscape of the expansion of the tech throughout the country.
It really goes back to the dystopianness that you were talking about, right? That you can be misidentified as a shoplifter and banned from like just a normal retail shop if it gets much further. I mean, where I live, the only kind of food retailer within walking distance is a Co-op. It's just the only one. And if you can see how if you got banned from there, you could find yourself in some difficulty.
Exactly.
The policing minister is an interesting one. Isn't it true that the only way we knew that some police forces were using facial recognition technology is because we found out from the policing minister rather than the police forces themselves who refused to say whether or not they were using it?
Yeah, so I think initially there were some denials that territorial police forces in the UK were using FRT, but then after this, Chris Philp did acknowledge actually that all 43 UK territorial police forces were using retrospective FRT. That was last year, so in light of the expansion, this could have changed since then. But that was confirmed by Chris Philp.
But it's pretty wild that individual police forces would deny using a technology they're using when asked. That's not traditionally how oversight's supposed to work.
For sure.
But so you did this poll, and MPs are worryingly underinformed and or uninterested. But you didn't leave it there, right? What happened next?
Yeah, we continued to monitor the developments, particularly this year. So just on the previous point regarding the previous government, they seem to be taking step after step, dedicating increasing spending for policing to use FRT. So for example, the spring 2024 budget actually was going to provide police forces with 230 million for the delivery of police technology pilot schemes, such as live facial recognition and even deploying drones as first responders. So we were seeing increasing steps towards funding for live FRT for police forces.
So there was going to be increasing funding despite the fact that MPs maybe didn't have the tools required to evaluate whether that was an appropriate use of government money.
Yes, and furthermore, in April of 2024, the previous government had actually made a further announcement around tackling retail-related offences, and they committed a further 4 million for bespoke mobile units, which were to be deployed on high streets across the country using live facial recognition to tackle shoplifting with the use of FRT.
Yeah, that's so true. So on the one hand, we're seeing the use of the tech being ramped up by the government, and then on the other, through our research and through this survey, we're seeing that MPs were not equipped well with the knowledge, as you said, to really scrutinise or provide oversight or real debate in Parliament about the implications of this tech being rolled out. So after we got the survey results, we decided to call on members of the public to write to their MPs and raise concerns over the use of the tech, and also ask their MPs for information, because one of the problems is the lack of transparency. We don't have a full picture of where and how FRT is actually being used and by whom throughout the United Kingdom. So we asked people who also felt concerned by our findings to write to their own local MPs and ask them to respond to these concerns and actually give them information on whether or not FRT was being used in their local area.
And did people write to their MP?
Yeah, people did write to their MP, which was amazing. So it was great to see responses from members of the public and other people, around the country were sharing our concerns, and not only sharing them, but actually voicing them, taking the step to write to their elected representatives, and not just write to them, but ask them to actually take action, find out this information and share it with them as well.
What have the responses been like? Have MPs been responding with a sudden wave of enthusiasm and transparency?
A wave of enthusiasm and transparency, maybe putting it very strongly, Caitlin. Unfortunately, I wish that had been the case. However, I don't want to speak too soon because this campaign is ongoing. It's an open action. So people do still have the option to write to their MPs, and I hope they still are as well. So we expect to get more responses on that front. Obviously, there's a new government now as well, and so a couple of new MPs. No, essentially the responses were mixed. But what was disappointing to see is that so far, all of the responses that we have seen from MPs have ignored the questions that constituents actually included in their correspondence. So they were kind of very generic responses, and they were not sharing the information that constituents requested, which was, where and how in my constituency is this surveillance technology being used. That's what we've seen so far from the responses, but I'd like to remain optimistic for future ones.
That's the bit that's most damning to me, because if you're writing to your local MP to say, hey, am I experiencing, or am I likely to experience as I walk around the area that you represent, seriously invasive and concerning technologies that I've neither consented to or know anything about? Could you let me know? And so far, fingers crossed that statistic will change. Every single person has gone, I'm going to swerve that one.
Yeah.
Because we were quite specific, right? We were asking people to take a series of actions that were like, write to your local retail consortium and ask them if they're using facial recognition technology. So it was a not insignificant part of the email. It was hard to miss that kind of section.
Indeed. So asking the MP to provide the information on where and how in the constituency FRT is being used was one point, but people who took part in the campaign, wrote to that MP, were also asking the MP to contact, as you said, Caitlin, local retail consortium and the chief constable of their local area to ask whether retailers and or police forces in that area are using FRT or planning to use FRT. And to our knowledge so far, none of the MPs did this.
Which sucks. I think
yes, it does. Yeah, and I think, although what we've seen so far from MPs' response to the campaign has been disappointing and less transparent than we would have hoped, as I said, the campaign is ongoing. And what is really great to see is that people are taking action to hold their elected representatives to account. And, some people are pushing them repeatedly for this information. And I think that's really encouraging. And that's something that we're going to be continuing to ask people to do, to voice their concerns and get politicians to pay attention.
Yeah, so following the campaign at the start of the year in January, we wrote a letter alongside other civil society organisations that are too campaigning against the use of FRT, such as Big Brother Watch and Liberty. So we wrote to the former Home Secretary, raising the concerns with FRT across the UK, as well as informing him of the survey we conducted and that people were writing to MPs and the responses that we were getting weren't really convincing. Since then, we have also continued to work collectively with other UK NGOs. We wrote a letter to retailers asking them to commit to stop using FRT within their stores. We've also recently wrote a joint letter to the new Home Secretary asking for a meeting regarding FRT as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, but just part of the reason that we launched the campaign, The End of Privacy in Public, is that the expansion of FRT in public spaces in the UK that we're seeing is ringing alarm bells, because it's looking like we're taking kind of the first steps down the road, which could theoretically end in a very dystopian biometric surveillance state where it would be conceivable for everybody to be identified and also tracked everywhere that they go in real time as they move through public spaces. I think that is something that we are working to avoid.
Nice. So an article's coming soon with more information, more analysis, more specifics on the MP's responses, so keep an eye out on the website. You can always sign up at pvcy.org/subscribe pbi.org/pod sign up to be the first to hear about stuff that PI is doing. You can also, Parliament has also changed quite a lot. Out of the 650 MPs that are currently sitting, 335 have never been an MP before. So if you want to write to your MP, if you want to find out what's happening in your constituency, if you've written before but your MP has changed, another great opportunity to reach out, please do. You can find the action at pvcy.org/end of privacy. And please do sign up, find out more, and take action.
On the back of all of that, there's two things I would love to pick up on with you, Caitlin. First is, if you're not based in the United Kingdom, if you don't have a member of parliament, as we've been talking about throughout this podcast, is there something that we can translate to other countries and contexts so that people can wonder what they can do?
Well, the first thing to say is that, yes, the campaign template that we've set up and the work that we're doing in the background with the responses that we're getting is UK specific, but the information is not. So if you're outside of the UK and you're worried about your privacy, you're worried about the use of facial recognition where you are, you're welcome to look at those resources and you're welcome to reshape them so they're relevant to where you are. For example, you might not have a constituency, you might have a state, or you might have a municipality, you might have any number of things. You may not have a police commissioner. Your system will likely differ, your mileage may vary, but you're very welcome to take those, reshape them, and then ask your own representatives, because it's absolutely not a UK specific problem. And you have the right almost everywhere to find out what is happening where you live and what you're being subjected to as you walk out into the street. So the first thing to do, and the first thing I would suggest that you do if you're interested, is do some Googling, take a look at the campaign page, which is at pvcy.org/end of privacy, link in the description, and see what's relevant to you and see if it's something that you would like to find out more about and something you'd like to ask your representative in whichever kind of system that you have, what's happening where you live.
And if you ever get around to writing that in a different language and you want to let us know that you've translated it into a different language so we can make it available to other people if they ever contact us, we'd very much welcome that.
Oh yeah, we'd love that. So email Gus. And if you do get a response, we might not be able to do much with it, but it is always interesting to us to find out what's happening around the world, because we're not actually a UK organization.
And the second aspect of what I wanted to cover is that, yes, facial recognition is not just a UK issue, of course. But also, what's not solely limited to the UK is that politicians don't necessarily understand, or policymakers do not necessarily understand, the technologies that are being used. And raising their level of understanding is a Sisyphean task. And it is absolutely worth it. We often remember when Mark Zuckerberg was brought before the Senate in the US after the Cambridge Analytica fiasco. And the people in our world of tech policy were hoping that Zuckerberg would be held to account. And instead, he faced very old people asking very dumb questions about the internet. And it wasn't the best sessions. But what people may not remember is that the next day, he was grilled thoroughly by the House of Representatives. And they asked very pointed and very well-informed questions, and it held him to account. It held that company to account. And so it is possible, when you actually engage with our politicians and policymakers and you help them understand things, it does get better. And that wasn't an ageist joke I was making about the Senate, because, again, going back to my old career, and I've probably mentioned this before, but in the 1990s, when we were fighting UK surveillance law and trying to explain for the first time to politicians what the internet was and what was encryption, the lower house in the United Kingdom, the equivalent of the House of Representatives in the US, the members of Parliament or MPs, House of Commons, they couldn't care less, because all they cared about was political calculus and how many MPs are in the government, who's going to win the vote. But when we engaged with the House of Lords, this unrepresentative relic of 15th century politics in the UK, they were very engaged. They were very old people, but they understood that the details mattered and they can understand the technologies and they can ask hard questions like they did in the 1990s. And they did hold the government to account. So it's possible to get this to happen.
I think one of the things when you're thinking about politicians, and unfortunately, sometimes you have to give them some latitude, which is if you think about the volume of legislation a politician has to deal with, engage with, kind of be up to date with, the volume of issues, the volume of concerns, then you can kind of give them some leeway to say, yeah, you're probably not going to be the most well-informed on every single thing. What does make politicians get interested is public interest. They represent you. And if you tell them something you care about, then they have an obligation to follow up on it. And they're ultimately, unfortunately, in some respects, people. And not all people are good with tech. And not all people have the same instinctive interest in surveillance and privacy that we do. So it really does matter, even if you're not doing the whole full formal letter and you're saying, hey, I'm worried about facial recognition. It bothers me because that's great. And even if, you don't get the best response back, then over time, that buildup of like, a lot of people are talking to people about facial recognition is really, really useful to us. And sometimes it is honestly quite tricky to understand. Like it's difficult for some people to look past the obvious potential for law enforcement to the massive negative consequences. And it's a very naive understanding of that technology, but it's also a very common surface level understanding of that technology. And what our job is to come in and say, no, it worries me. It worries me because it's discriminatory, it's not good enough, because it's misidentifying, and it's being used in these incredibly damaging ways by companies. And what are you doing about it? Because the answer at the moment is not enough, because you don't understand the issues, because you think there's already a law, which is crazy that our poll found that. Like some 20-30% of politicians were saying, we think there's already a law governing facial recognition, which there is not. It's unreasonable to assume that politicians know enough to do their jobs, not because they don't want to, not because they're malicious about it, not because they're working against their interests, but because they're people and because they can only know so many things at one time.
And we want to be able to sit with them to give them the briefings. We want them to be knocking on our door to give them the briefings. But when we reach out to them out of the blue and say, hey, we would love to be able to talk to you about these things, the first response they'll give us every single time is, well, none of my constituents seem to care. Nobody's ever raised this issue with me. This doesn't sound very interesting to the people I represent. If through your actions we can change that, then I would like to believe that good politicians will respond. And I can say in my experience, they have almost always done so.
Yeah. And wait for the article. It's coming, I promise. It goes into way more detail about the responses we got from politicians, because although none of them, and I mean none of them, of the ones that we saw at time of recording, appropriately answered the specific local questions that we asked, we did get long responses. Like they did engage with the concept, if not the kind of additional work that we asked them to do. So it's not like a hopeless thing, but politicians aren't magically better at technology than anyone else. They don't magically understand the issues with technology more than anyone else. Most of them aren't in the government. Most of them aren't getting briefings from, security services or whatever. Most of them are just people trying the best that they can. And it's almost our responsibility in a kind of civic democracy to give them the tools that they need to do the job appropriately. And the job is representing you. And so the tools are, what do you care about? What do you care about? And we hope you care about this.
Yeah. And the second aspect to that is these are complex problems that we're trying to solve as a society. And if a vendor or the police are telling a policymaker, hey, this technology will solve this, it's easy for the politician. It's just as easy as it is for a member of the public to say, oh, well, that sounds reasonable. Let's just go ahead with that. So our job is to disrupt that ease of briefing, that ease of logic that so easily dominates the thinking in this space, which is have technology will solve social problems.
We wish.
We wish. But AI is going to do that for us, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's great. We can outsource all governing to the robots.
Yes.
Because the robots have never been a problem before. My robot vacuum, which to be fair is 20 years old or something ridiculous, it still can't work out how chairs work. So.
Well, thank you for listening. Remember, if you're based in the UK, you can still, and please do, write to your MP to find out more. You can find more info on our website at pbcy.org/endofprivacy. If you're not based in the UK, but have representatives and are interested in learning what's happening in your area, feel free to use our resources. Remember, you can sign up to be the first to hear more about our work at pbcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening, or on our website at pbcy.org/techpill. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.